Hello, Endeavor here. So, just put some ones in the chat if we are live. We are back with another edition of Classic Movies, albeit a few minutes behind schedule, but it's the Christmas season and we're all in this kind of relaxed mood, so it's not a big deal. How are you doing, Morgoth?
Hello, I'm still waking up. I apologize to everybody watching, the audience. I fell asleep on the settee and I was having an afternoon nap after Sunday dinner, and I didn't actually think I'd nod off. And I just had a huge panic when I woke up and saw the time. So I'm here. I was napping. I'm old, and I had a Sunday afternoon nap that ran too long. So I apologize for being late, everybody.
It's all right. I mean, it's the Christmas season, and what is Christmas if you can't relax on the couch and doze off for a few minutes? That's what the season's all about. And tonight we're here with our Christmas special, and we have two great Christmas classics this year. So we're going to be doing not one, but two. We're going to be doing the 1984 adaptation of Charles Dickens' famous Christmas novella, A Christmas Carol, a story which I'm certain everyone has heard before. And then we'll also be comparing it and contrasting it with the 1946 film, It's a Wonderful Life, which is another one which I'm sure most people will have seen before. I think it might be a bit more popular in North America than it is in Europe, but it's another one of those timeless Christmas classics, which almost everyone has seen at least once. So anyway, I think what we'll start off with is A Christmas Carol. And I passed it over to Morgoth to decide which adaptation of A Christmas Carol we're going to do, because there are probably hundreds of them. Every single cartoon I know of has some kind of parody of A Christmas Carol. It seems like a new movie is released every couple of years, and many of them are very good. It's a great story, obviously, timeless classic, and a lot of the adaptations are really good. But you chose the 1984 version. Why'd you choose that one?
I remembered out of all of the different versions of Christmas Carol, I remembered, because you know how you get all nostalgic and you think about your childhood and everything. And I remembered when I was a boy and I was a little lad, there was one of the ones which stuck out at me the most, because the Ghost of Christmas Future terrified me. I just found this to be the most sort of adult of the ones that I'd come across, because it gets kind of mixed up. And I just remembered, that one I'll watch again, because I remember it seemed so serious and scary. It is quite unnerving when I was a lad, and I watched it again for this, and I was equally impressed. I thought it was very well written, very well done, and that's the one that I wanted to revisit. Not that I've got lots of preference, because they do tend to blend into each other a little bit, but I really like this one.
All right, I think it was a good choice. It was the first time I had seen this adaptation of A Christmas Carol. Obviously, there are plenty of them, though. Another really good one would be the 1951 version, which is called Scrooge, but it's the exact same story. I even like the 2009 version. I thought that one was really good as well. So you really can't go wrong with any version, but I did really like this one. And I'm pretty sure that this stream is pretty much applicable to whatever version you decide to watch. So I think that all the themes are the same, and you can pretty much apply it to any of them. I did really like this version. One thing I really thought was very atmospheric was just the beginning of the movie, where Scrooge is in his office, and then there are like the kids outside, and Tiny Tim is waiting on the corner, and then Scrooge is walking home in the evening, and you just feel cold as you're watching it. You feel like you feel yourself shivering in the cold winter air of London of the 19th century. A Christmas Carol, it is really probably the most famous Christmas story ever written. And I don't think I need to go through the plot for anyone, because I'm pretty sure everyone has heard the story of Ebenezer Scrooge, the greedy old wealthy man who is visited by the ghost of Christmas past, Christmas present, Christmas future, who convince him to change his ways. So it's definitely it's a fascinating story, and it's one that it's just really this timeless classic. The theme that I saw, kind of the overarching theme, and I know that this is also like with these stories, they're also something which are very cozy, and we'll get into the Christmassy stuff later. I thought what we'll do at first, we'll tackle all the heavy theory cell stuff, and then towards the end of the stream, we'll just talk more about the festive feel that these films give you. The theme that I saw in A Christmas Carol and It's a Wonderful Life as well, because It's a Wonderful Life was inspired by A Christmas Carol. The theme which runs through both of them is the conflict between the aristocrat and the oligarch. So if we read our Aristotle, he describes various different kinds of regimes way back in the ancient world. Both Aristotle and Plato wrote about this. So the definition of an aristocracy was a rule by an elite few, but a just rule by an elite few, whereas a oligarchy is a rule by an elite few, but a unjust rule. So today with modern politics, we think a lot about the structure of a regime, the constitution of it, but we don't really think so much about the actual character of those in power. But for the ancients, that was actually a lot more important. Someone like Aristotle put a lot more thought onto the actual character of the people in charge. So what you see with Ebenezer Scrooge is that he starts off as the oligarch. So and the arc of the story, it's the struggle between the oligarch and the aristocrat. So Scrooge is an extremely wealthy, powerful, and influential man, and he's capable of being either, but he's an extremely materialistic guy. He only cares about his money. He seems like this miserable old grouch. And the Christmas season to him, a time which brings joy to most people, he just kind of sees it as this inconvenience. It's just a time where he can't rake in as much profit as he usually does. And his kind of character arc, it's him kind of transitioning into the aristocrat. So you see from The Ghost of Christmas Past with Mr. Fezziwig. Mr. Fezziwig is he's the aristocrat already because he's a wealthy man, but he also actually has like some idealism. He actually wants to spread joy as well. He organizes this great Christmas party for all of his apprentices and the community which he lives in. And Scrooge starts out as that, but then he kind of turns into this grouch. And you see towards the end of the movie, he kind of regains that idealism, and he becomes the aristocrat.
Yeah, that's true. Well, one of the things that I found about this one in particular was just they really laid bare how, like Scrooge's house, like how, because you know the Christmas Carol, it's one of those things where you get kind of hammered with it when you're a kid. And then this is actually the first time in decades that I actually sat down and watched an incarnation of the Christmas Carol. So it's strange because you pick up on things that you don't actually expect. And one of the little touches in this one that I really liked was the way they made Scrooge's house so Spartan. Like, it wasn't that. I think today, when we think of somebody who is like a Scrooge kind of character, there tends to be an idea that in his private life he'd be corrupt or ostentatious or something like that. But Scrooge really meant it. Like, so in this one, in the George C. Scott version, his house is almost completely bare. Like, he really does live like a pauper. And when I was watching it, and I looked at, like, he's a rich man, but he lives like a poor man. And I thought there's something in that. There's something very Protestant about it. There's something very, and you wonder, like, what is the point of it all? If you've got this much wealth, but because today, again, when we think of somebody as being materialistic, you think, well, they love all of the baubles and all of the glimmering lights and fashions and trends or having a nice car or whatever. But Scrooge has got almost nothing. Like his house, which is big, but it's almost just completely bare. And you get the little touches where the fire's never on because it would cost him on coal. And he's a Scrooge with how much candlelight he puts on. And it's beautiful little touches. Like, there's one tiny little candle for his whole living room when he gets in. and you see him sitting there, sort of shivering, eating like a bowl of soup just on his own. And you just think, what's it all for? Like, what is the point of it all? If this is how you're going to live, then why bother with all? Why not just be actually poor instead of working? And like, what is the money for? He doesn't have any kids. He doesn't have anything, and you just think it's fascinating. It's as if he's got a kind of this weird obsession, and that was one of the things that really jumped out at me in this version.
Yeah, so with Scrooge, the background of him is that he, as a young man, actually kind of did have a soul. You see in Christmas Past, when he was mentored by Mr. Fezziwig, who was this kind of joyful, boisterous guy he was a great businessman. But then once Christmas Eve came and the bell struck, then it was time to enjoy the finer things in life, and it was time to dance and have a feast and have fun and everything, and actually have a sense of community and actually spend some time together. Because again, if you spend all the year making money, well, you have to actually use it with something. And you see with Scrooge in the segment about the ghost of Christmas Past, when he's shown his past, he actually is a lot more idealistic in his past. So he was in love with a woman. He loved his sister as well. That he was very close with her, and he was heartbroken by her death. And the only family member who he has is his nephew, who his sister died in childbirth delivering. So that's the only connection he has to anyone by blood. It's his nephew. And then you see at the beginning of the movie that his nephew's trying to get Scrooge to come to their Christmas dinner the following day, but he's saying, "Oh no, I don't want to do it." And he has the famous line, "Bah humbug." So he's saying, "Oh, I want to go home and just be a grouch," pretty much. You see though with him that it's the materialism that really does corrupt him. So it's that endless pursuit of profit. So as a young man, he actually gets engaged to the woman who he falls in love with, but then his relentless pursuit of profit really just pushes her away from him. And then they never end up marrying, and she leaves him. They were engaged, but they break it off, and he basically pursues a life of profit. And ultimately it is a pretty miserable life, because if you're going to actually make all that money, you actually want something to do with it. And you see that towards the end of the film, that he becomes the aristocrat, in that he's not simply someone who's wealthy. Now, he remains a wealthy man. He doesn't give all his wealth away, but he uses it to actually further the human flourishing of the broader society. So he donates to the charity. He gives a raise to his worker. He becomes a second father figure to Tiny Tim. He reconnects with his nephew, and you can see that he kind of transforms into what Aristotle would describe as a aristocrat. So he's still, again, a very wealthy and powerful man, but he's a just one now, and one who actually has the broader human flourishing of society in mind.
And the key to this is to be an aristocrat is that he has a community. Because the key with Scrooge is that he doesn't really have any friends. He's not part of the wider community. He has relatives, but he's got nothing but contempt for them. He even has nothing but contempt for his fellow businessmen as well. And so what his redemption arc and turning into more aristocratic form, as you would say, is that he actually forges those bonds with his fellow man. That's his redemption, is that he finds kindness and he finds loyalty, he finds love within his fellow man, within the people on the street, the Cratchits, and all of the rest of it. That's how he kind of comes back to life. So sometimes it's an obvious take, but it's also like quintessentially heartwarming. It's obviously got a nice, morally sound Christian messaging to it, and so it's so layered to be the perfect Christmas story. Just as a side point, because I've never actually read A Christmas Carol, the novel. I've read a lot of Charles Dickens. When I first started reading a long time ago, I read a lot of novels. I still read a lot of novels, but I've never actually read Christmas Carol. But I'm going to assume, unless anybody could correct us, that this is pretty much sticking very closely to the book. I think
it is very close to the book. Yes.
I think it comes across that this is exactly or pretty much close to how it is in the book. I think one of the interesting things I found was that his former partner Marley arrived. He's the first ghost to arrive, and he's got all of those chains hanging around him. What do you think the symbolism is of the chains?
Well, I guess it's maybe that he's just either enslaved to his work, or that he's just enslaved to kind of wither away because his soul is gone. He kind of just wasted it, and that there's nothing he really has in the afterlife. He's kind of just enslaved because he never actually made anything of his life beyond just the material wealth that he accumulated.
Yeah, it's the burdens. It's the burdens of greed which are built up. It's the chains that he's formed in life, chains of regret, and these are what's going to. And Marley pointed out to Scrooge that, you may look at me shackled with all of this, but that this is nothing compared to what's heading your way, Scrooge, and you're going to find out why. You're going to put your whole. This is what's similar between the two films. Is that your life and the actions and the choices that you've made in your life are now going to be brought into perspective, and you're going to be judged on that, judged like sort of objectively on what it is you've accomplished, how it is that you've treated your fellow man, and where it is that this will all lead to. And it's all based on like sort of your free will, the choices that you've chosen. So Marley is weighed down by these chains, but Scrooge's are going to be much, much heavier because he's a worse character altogether. And so what the film does is the story cleverly sets it up to explain exactly why it is that way. And as you were pointing out, the long path which has led him this way from the past as well. It's kind of tragic as well because he never consciously set out to be Scrooge. He never consciously set out to be this kind of heartless, cold, old grumpy crone that nobody likes. But it was sort of incrementally, it is interesting when you think of the free will in that way, because he is being judged as to being, let's say, a bad man. But at no point in his life did he consciously choose to be that way. It was just day in, day out, small decisions being made, which ended up sort of being more and more self-centered. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And you really see in the final segment, The Ghost of Christmas Future, where it really drives home the point. I think probably the most powerful thing, more so than just seeing Scrooge's tombstone, because I mean, of course, he sees his tombstone, and then he weeps and he says, "Oh, take me back, please." But I think what's even more powerful is the scene where there's these like riffraff of London who are just scavenging Scrooge's belongings and then selling them off once he dies. So all that's left of him, the day that he dies, all that's left of him is just whatever stuff he had in his house. Just various vagabonds in London are just going to go in and then just ravage it and try to sell it off and make a quick buck off of it. And that's all that's going to be left of him when he dies. No one's going to remember him. He's barely in the life of the only blood relative he has alive, and basically he would just be forgotten. And then you'll see that his business partners, they just say something about, "Oh yeah, well that's too bad. Well, I need to go find out the price of corn." So they barely even give a thought to him. So even though he had all that wealth, it doesn't actually buy him a legacy. It doesn't buy him anything. It doesn't buy him anything after death. And that's something which a lot of people might not think about in the modern world, but it's something which really does matter to people. Like what you're going to be remembered by well, that's gonna definitely wear on you in your life, especially I'd imagine towards the later ends. And Scrooge realizes that if he doesn't change his ways, if he just is the oligarch who just accumulated a bunch of wealth and just pursued his own self-interests and never actually gave back, well, then he's just going to be remembered for nothing. And that he realizes he needs to use that last a bit of his life, which he has left, to become the aristocrat, to actually become someone who, as someone with wealth and power, actually facilitates human flourishing in the community around him.
Yeah, I mean, because it literally happens in real life as well. I remember there was a story of this probably before your time. There was a woman called Anna Nicole Smith, and I think she was about 26, and she was like a bimbo and a model of some sort. She might have even dabbled in a bit of sort of porn or something, but she married this like 89-year-old billionaire or something, and it was just purely obvious because it was for his wealth. It was obvious that nobody cared about him at all, and he died, and then it all ended up in this like grotesque kind of, and it was in all of the tabloids as well, where all anybody wanted to do was scramble over his money and suing each other and all of this. She died. She ended up dying young as well, for God knows what. It's years ago and all this was happening, but it was a kind of, it was a sort of the Cardassians of its day. It was this kind of grotty, kind of soul crushing, sort of greedy, it was all seedy and horrible. And it's kind of like what happens with Scrooge when you see all of the tinkers coming around, hawk his life's worth. I mean, nobody gives a damn about him. Nobody hardly even remembers his name. And so he sees this. He has his face rubbed in this, and it's horrifying to think of it like that. It's a real. When you think of it, because what it does is make you think about your own life and the choices that you've made in your own life. You're kind of reflecting back on it. Now, yes, obviously Scrooge is a nasty, bad man, but when you see a life kind of sliced up from the past and the present, and then where the decisions that you've made in the future are all going, it's a little bit like it's holding a mirror up and asking you those questions. What have you done? Like, not in terms of gaining wealth or your career, but just in the way that you've treated those around you and things like that. It's a Christmas message. It's the time for reflecting them things, which is why it endures on and on and on. It's a beautiful tale in that regard. It's a relic of a more wholesome, intelligent, gentle era, when there's just this sense that in the past people were more morally sound. And it's because they had stories like this instead of the kind of nihilistic trash that we have now. That really deserves to be emphasized when you talk about something like Christmas Carol. I'm a huge fan of this kind of thing. But when you actually understand fully what it's asking of you to ask of yourself, it's quite stern. It's quite a hard taskmaster, because maybe you're a bit of a dick. Maybe you do need to be questioning yourself someday. I certainly do. I'm by no means perfect. I've made stupid mistakes.
And it's interesting because you mentioned the era when it was written. So the novella was written by Charles Dickens in 1843, and I think that that's actually very relevant to the story because, of course, when Dickens wrote this, it was just took place in the contemporary times when he was writing. But I think it's really interesting to look at A Christmas Carol in the time period which it was actually written and when it was actually set. So this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So it's already in full swing. This was just after the factories had opened, urbanization was expanding, tons of people were moving into the cities. But society hadn't really adjusted to the new change, the new world that they were living in then. There's a question which Greg Johnson has asked people on many occasions, and the question was that, can you think of any time in history where you would be on the left? So asking right wingers, is there any point in history where you would actually maybe not be far left, but at least be left leaning? And I thought of that, and I thought the two of them, the two answers I came to, I mean, one of them is not relevant to the stream, but the other one was it would probably be around this time period. It would have been around the early Industrial Revolution, because I mean, I'm not somebody that wants to, I'm not someone who believes that the West is evil or that our civilization is illegitimate or anything. By no means believe that, but it is true that the working conditions in the early Industrial Revolution were pretty horrific. So before they had the new laws and the new kind of way of dealing with the changes in society, they would have worked things like 12-hour work days in factories or longer. I think the very first law, like one of the very first labor laws in England, was a law which banned labor for children under the age of 9. So yeah, before that, children under the age of 9 were working in factories, and that between the ages of 9 and 18, 12 hours a day was the maximum. Yes, the maximum, meaning that someone who was like some 12-year-old could be working 12 hours a day in a factory. And that meant that people who were older than that were working longer. But this was considered to be kind of easing the work conditions, making things actually kind of better for the workers. And this is before labor unions, before a lot of the laws. The wages weren't great, and the factories were definitely not safe. Now, I don't mean to levy this huge moral indictment against society at the time. They were dealing with something new. It was a transition period, and people were figuring things out. It was something totally new, which you see with every time there's a new technology. Just think about with the internet. Think about back in 2016 when we could say anything we wanted. Then the people in charge realized, oh, we don't want to allow them to do that. But anyway, I definitely never would have sided with the far left. So Marxists, anarchists, utopian socialists. I don't think that they ever really have had a point. I think that they've always been incorrect. However, the more moderate, what would have been called the left at the time, the people who were really kind of looking at the Industrial Revolution and taking this into consideration and thinking, well, is this really how we want to live? Is this really how we? Is this the kind of life that we want to give people? I think that things need to change. I am very sympathetic with the labor movement of the 19th century, especially when you look at decades like the 1840s and you see the conditions they were living in. So, like, if you ask me, would you rather live in 1740 or 1840? I'd say I'd rather live in 1740 because that was before. That's when everyone was still living on farms, and that was before they were all like crammed into these factories. Charles Dickens is someone who he does really belong to that. It's social critique. So something like A Christmas Carol. It's not just a story about morality. It is a critique of the society at the time, because there really were miserable conditions. And I do think that the story is really powerful when you think of it that way, because it was something which people it was a question which people had to ask themselves. The question was, maybe it is making people like Scrooge or, just any kind of businessman, it might be making you an insane amount of wealth, this new industrial world. But is that all there is to it? Don't you want society to shouldn't we actually have this broader flourishing of society? And I think that when people actually made these decisions to try to improve the conditions, obviously increasing the wages, but also limiting the work hours. I mean, working for 12 hours a day, it just seems absolutely miserable. I do think that the story really was of its time, in that it was a very cutting critique of that era in British history.
Well, funny enough, in the film, I'll say the film because I don't know if it's in the book, but Edward Woodward plays the ghost of Christmas Present, the wonderful Edward Woodward, who people may know from The Equalizer and The Wicker Man, which more people seem to be interested in our circles, which we will probably cover one day. But when they go to the Cratchit's house and you see the miserable conditions, like their turkey's tiny as well, or I think it might be a goose. But at any rate, it's tiny. Their Christmas dinner is pretty miserable. But Scrooge tries to say, like, at the end of the day, I'm supporting this whole family. They are able to do this because of me and my money and me employing Bob Cratchit. And the Ghost of Christmas Present, like he kind of drags him over the coals for that, because they're just not doing that well. But he makes another point, and he says, like, you have to understand that whether you like this or not, what you are doing here is heaping up troubles which are going to come for you in the end. And I think he means social troubles. And I also think what he means is a kind of radical sort of proletarian movement which will organize itself against people like Scrooge, which is interesting because, I mean, I don't really want to bring another movie in, but I've written and I've spoken quite a bit about a film called The Shooting Party this year, which is wonderful. And this deals with something similar, where it's set just before World War One, and it kind of meditates on the relationship with the upper classes, the old-fashioned aristocrats just before World War One, and the working man. And there's this sort of paternalistic duty of care that James Mason has, who plays the Lord, with the gamekeepers, with the men of the land, who are all going to be marching off to war. And you can see there's a tension there with a newer elite coming up who view the working class just as labor and nothing else. And in a way, like, Scrooge is that, or in sort of embryonic form, long before it actually existed. So you've got the choice here. You can embrace the old aristocratic forms, where you've still got a duty of care to the poor, but it's based more on tradition and Christian morality, where if you're employing people and you are responsible for people, you can't just treat them like dirt. You can't just treat them like slaves, and you can't just replace them. You can't just think of them as replaceable cogs. You actually do have connection with them. You have moral binds with them. And this, of course, is exactly what Scrooge has severed himself from. And so the Ghost of Christmas Present seems to be saying, well, okay, in the short term, and you can deal with it. You don't seem to have a conscience about what you're doing to the poor. But in the long term, what you're going to have is a kind of atheistic version of this. It's almost as if he was saying, like, you carry on like this and you're going to get a Marxist revolution. Like, this is a problem. This is something that has to be dealt with. And if you don't do it in the old-fashioned ways, the ways of caring for people and on Christian morality, something else will come and that will fill its place. And you're going to end up in an even worse situation. And that kind of jumped out at me watching the film the other day. I thought, there's a writer or somebody, or maybe Dickens himself, because Dickens was highly critical he wrote another book called Hard Times, which I've read, which it's mainly in the north. I think it's in Birmingham, Sheffield, these places, and it paints these pictures of smog and decay, and people being huddled into the off the land and into these industrialized wastelands. And I just wrote an article the other day about contrasting England to Ireland in this regard, which is on my Substack. And so it was almost like, yeah, you're going to have to change your ways one way or another. And obviously, what we see by the end, the redemption of Scrooge, is that it's in reforging those more paternalistic bonds.
Yeah, and one thing that's interesting is in the segment with the Ghost of Christmas Past, what you see is England before the Industrial Revolution. So this is just at the very beginning of it. So it's still the kind of romantic Europe of the 18th century. So very agrarian lifestyle. People aren't crammed into these big cities yet. The air is clean. You don't have this dirt and smog hovering over the cities with all the factories that have been built. And remember, this is before plumbing. So just imagine like the filth that would have been in the streets of one of these newly industrialized cities like London at the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution, around the time this was written, with all the people like cramming in. It wouldn't have been a very pretty place, but you kind of get a glimpse at the before times. You kind of get a glimpse at the times before the Industrial Revolution. It looks a lot more pleasant. So in the early segments where riding through villages on horses, Scrooge goes to this, like, I mean, he's not so exactly happy at the academy, but the academy looks quite nice. The factory which Mr. Fezziwig owns looks a lot more pleasant than wherever people would be working in London, in the London which Scrooge lives in. So you kind of see the Industrial Revolution. You see it in progress throughout Scrooge's life, and in some ways, he actually kind of follows the arc, that same arc, because, like you mentioned earlier, he never set out to become this kind of miserly, greedy grouch who doesn't care about anything other than increasing his bottom dollar. But that's kind of just the way that history took him, because you think of the early Industrial Revolution, perhaps that was the best way to maximize profit, perhaps having 12-hour work days. Now, there are some arguments that people will say that, well, reducing the actual amount of work hours makes workers makes them more efficient, which I can see the argument there. But let's just assume, for argument's sake, that isn't true. Let's just assume that the cold, hard, just materialistic, heartless kind of capitalism which Scrooge embodies. Let's just assume that actually is the most efficient. Now, I don't know whether that's actually true or not. I have my doubts of that. But Well, then what is the issue there? Well, the issue there is that it's sacrificing real human flourishment for the line on the graph going up. And you kind of see that a lot with the Industrial Revolution. I can imagine a lot of people in Europe at the time. Now, of course, they couldn't possibly go back. It couldn't be undone. I'm not one of these. I'm not someone who believes that the Industrial Revolution was a disaster for the human race or anything like that. But you can kind of see that. You could kind of imagine people in Europe at the time feeling like something had been lost. The life in the countryside, with the village church, with the agrarian farmers, the landed gentry, the craftsmen making these beautiful chairs. Well, now they don't need that anymore. Now they need miners. Now they need guys to work in the factory to mass produce these chairs that what a craftsman would take a couple of days to make, the factory could make thousands of them in that same amount of time. Now, of course, that was a change which happened, and that we weren't going back from that. But I think that the question has to be, well, we can't forget about actual human flourishing. We might be able to make ourselves materially far more prosperous than we ever had been before. But that's not really the only thing which is important in life. And you kind of see with Scrooge that the life that he had as a young man, kind of in rural England, where he's riding around on the horse, he doesn't go back to that because he can't. But what he does do is he tries to make the new world where he again is on top, where he is the oligarch who becomes the aristocrat. He tries to make that more livable and more conducive to overall human flourishing by using the wealth and power which he has accumulated to actually give back to his community.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, like the symbolism of the coal in relation to the Industrial Revolution, because the Industrial Revolution was mainly powered on coal, and that the idea that you're going to tear out of the earth its resources and use it to fuel the steam engines and battleships and factories and turbines and all of this kind of thing, just to keep everything just firing along, belching smog up into the air and all of that. And Scrooge has obviously benefited from all of this, but at the same time, he doesn't even want to burn coal because that would be seen as a luxury. That would be because it would cost money. So he's, in a symbolic way, he rejects coal. He's kind of rejecting the processes of it as well, and the benefits that it's delivered, because it would heat his house up. It would add a bit of life to it. But it's just like, no, it's just about me. I mean, we mentioned it in the chat, but he is kind of like the quintessential libertarian in a way, isn't he? He's like, because it's put to him like, well, he asks the question time and again, is like, is there no place for these people in the workhouse? And I pay taxes to make sure that, and I'm taxed a lot. to make sure these people are like put in work farms or whatever it happens to be. Like just make the problem go away. I don't want to have to deal with it. It's just me and my money. Leave me alone. It is. I mean, it's a cliche to say, but Scrooge is kind of like the perfect libertarian.
Yeah, exactly. I actually made the exact same point in my notes that Scrooge is what we would call a libertarian today. So the guy who basically judges all of who demands a totally free market and who judges human flourishment by just the amount of dollars which are brought in by the GDP per capita or the line on the graph going up. And it's possible to look at this story through a leftist lens, which, you know, someone like Charles Dickens, I don't think he was definitely not a revolutionary or anything. I don't get the sense, but he was, you know, he probably would have been left leaning for his time. It's possible to look at that and then think about something like socialism. So the very idea of socialism as an ideology, it arose in response to the Industrial Revolution, in response to the living conditions which arose in these cities across the West, in Europe and North America at the time, because a lot of people really just thought, like, you know, we can't be living like this. We can't. This can't be the best way to do things. With all this prosperity, we have to find some way to actually make it work for a greater number of people. So you can look at it through this kind of leftist lens. And I do think that critique is definitely valid. I mean, because the libertarianism, as we would call it today, it wasn't called that back then, of course, but that really is what Scrooge embodies today. I remember you made a video a few years back. I think it was titled like "How Libertarianism Got Canceled." And it really is just about how libertarianism is just like this dog shit ideology, because it erodes everything which actually, it places zero value on anything which actually that actually makes life worth living and fulfilling in favor of the material. And even if it were true that the line on the graph would go up because of that, which is not even, it can be doubted, by the way. Is it even worth it? What better is it? How is life better if GDP is going up, but then you don't have a family, you don't have a community, you don't have a country, you don't have a culture, anything like that? And it's just a really hollow ideology. But then to take it back from the left, so to kind of recapture a Christmas Carol for the right, for someone like from our perspective, I don't get the sense with Charles Dickens that he has the same animosity towards Western society that you saw from someone like Karl Marx. And I know people will point out in the chat that Karl Marx was not of the West. And I think that a lot of his animosity towards the society that he lived in is because of that. But you see with the far left that they don't only want to tear down the economic system, they want to tear everything down. So someone like Marx, for example, he wants to get rid of religion. He wants to get rid of the family. He wants to get rid of the nation. He says that all of these are just tools of the capitalists to keep the proletariat oppressed, and that he wants that all of that's going to be destroyed. But when I read something like Charles Dickens, because Dickens really does, he gets into the grime of the early Victorian period. He really gets down and dirty and describes the real squalor of the time. And I do love that about them. It's very cutting social commentary. But the goodness of England always shines through. You still get the sense that there is some goodness. So the scenes in this movie, for example, when Scrooge is walking home as a grouch, like in the picture you see right here on the screen, and there are kids on the street corner who are probably working class kids, probably have very little, and they're singing Christmas carols. Well, that is the goodness. That is what actually is making life worth living. So in some ways, they're richer than Scrooge. Now, it's not. Now, that's not to say that they don't deserve to have better material conditions and that the economic system doesn't need to be fixed. But there actually is something there. I still get the sense that the family, the Scrooge's assistant, can't remember, I forgot the character's name, but off the top of my head. But you still get the sense that they're happier than Mr. Scrooge. I mean, they're cold, they're hungry, they're not very well off, but they still kind of have more. They still have a lot more than Mr. Scrooge does, because he goes home and he's just sitting there alone as a grouch. It's much better to have a little, but have people to share it with, than to have a lot, but just be alone in your own misery with that. The way that you can take A Christmas Carol back from the left is that there still is that idealism. You still get the sense that things like Christianity, like England, like British culture, you still get the sense that there was this goodness which exists there, and that needs to break through all of the squalor, and that there's a way to attain that, and it's by actually having this understanding of the world that it's not just the material that matters, it's these other things which matter more. And the thing is that Marxists don't do that, because they want to destroy all that as well in pursuit of the material, because in pursuit of a system which they consider to be more materially fair for the greater number of people. But as we saw in history, Marxists didn't really produce very prosperous societies either. So you end up with the emptiness and the nihilism as well. And you also end up with the miserable material comforts. You don't have any of the material comforts that is promising. So you end up in the squalor, but without any of the idealism either.
I mean, the heart of the story, which again is firmly rooted in Christian morality, is where you can say, well, as a form of commentary, it is on the right. So while that kind of Christian morality is in there, it's on the right. And when you kick that out and it becomes this kind of left-right sort of bickering over how resources and goods should be kind of dished out amongst the population, you find that you're actually, it doesn't matter whether, like, it's horrible that from today's perspective of the left today, Scrooge, they would say that Scrooge was a right-wing figure. Whereas the entire point, I think, the entire moral lesson of this, of the Christmas Carol, is a right-wing traditional message. And what happens is when you knock that out, because it's a moral claim. It's saying that you cannot morally do this to the people. Whereas from the left, the perspective is, it's based entirely on materialism, because there is no such moral claim, really. There is no God. So it's mainly a matter of people will be happier if they've got more stuff. And what happens is the pathetic sort of right-wing version of that is that I just care about myself and I don't care about anybody else, and I don't want other people coming after my stuff. And I find it like that kind of discourse is pretty grotesque either way. And one of the interesting points on Charles Dickens, of course, is that there's a kind of counterpoint to this in Bleak House with Mrs. Jellyby, where he brought in the term telescopic and empathy. So Mrs. Jellyby is also very well off, and she's very well to do. And this resonates a lot with our current times. But she is looking at the poor like very far away in different countries, when there's like people on her doorstep who don't have very much, and she just doesn't care about them one way or the other because it doesn't have that kind of high social status. And you can see like that's a kind of typical sort of libtard attitude of today. And Dickens doesn't seem to have very much time for that at all. Whereas here with Scrooge, it's literally like on his doorstep. He can't get away from it. Even in the picture that's on the screen, he's having to step over the poor. And it's this which this he has to answer for. This is what he has to go back over his life and have a moral judgment over. I mean, we haven't touched on it yet, but I do think the ghost of just the kind of spectre as it's portrayed in this is terrifying, as well as the two little what I forgot what it is, the ghost of, when he opens he's wearing like a Santa's costume and he opens up the coat.
That's Ghost of Christmas Present.
Yes, and he's got two little children there. And what is it? Is it Want and I forgot the two little children? But at any rate, it's Want and Neglect or something like that. And this is where he says like this will come for you in the end. Just on this kind of narrative level, the Ghost of Christmas Future is that's why I thought of this one, because it's this horrible sort of Grim Reaper apparition, and just the way that it floats around with its skeleton things. I was thinking, I'm surprised that this is 1984, and I'm surprised at how just what was put on like mainstream television, because I was a small boy when I watched this, and it scared the crap out of me. I was properly traumatized by that thing. But I mean that was an 80s thing. When you look back on what children watched in the 80s, and it was pretty terrifying stuff which was being peddled to kids, and and this was one of it. That's why I remembered it so well. So I guess that's one way you can make these things stick in kids' mind.
Yeah. You think we're ready to switch over to It's a Wonderful Life?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, it ties back to this as well.
Yeah, because it is a very similar story. So, It's a Wonderful Life was released in 1946. I'm just going to get an image on screen here. 1 second. Okay. Yeah, here it is. Iconic image of James Stewart here with his family. So It's a Wonderful Life was released in 1946. And it's based on A Christmas Carol, but it's gone on to become a Christmas classic of its own. So it was actually inspired by a story which was inspired by A Christmas Carol, but it is a different narrative. So the story arc is not exactly the same. It's not an adaptation of A Christmas Carol, but the themes are very similar, and it touches on a lot of the same messages. So how popular is this movie in Britain? Because I know this is something which is extremely popular in North America, but do you guys watch it there too?
Yeah, we do. But I mean, it is over culturally. It's like my parents would have liked this, my dad would like this. But I think culturally it is overshadowed by A Christmas Carol, because that's so firmly rooted in Britain, in British history. And the idea of Christmas in Britain, like, it kind of is A Christmas Carol. It is Victorian nostalgia coded. And so we can kind of watch this, but it will be this is an American thing. And I know that sounds obvious, but it does matter, because it means that you've got a little bit of distance between yourself and the actual story and the film. That like a kind of little barrier that we don't have, just by virtue of the fact that we're British and not American. But yeah, it is well known. It is regarded as a classic.
Well, yeah. So should I go through the plot of this one, or do you think everyone probably knows the plot already? So
I will run through it, because
okay. So
especially I was surprised at how long. Like, I was surprised at the running. Like, there's a good hour and a bit of setting his life story up, which I didn't realize it was so long either. But I think that probably needs addressing. The first.
Okay, so I'll do a quick plot rundown of It's a Wonderful Life. So the movie starts off with George Bailey, the main character played by James Stewart. And he's feeling extremely depressed on Christmas Eve, and he's contemplating suicide. So it has a supernatural element as well. So God says to an angel that he needs to send him down to earth to prevent George from committing suicide on Christmas Eve. And before he sends the angel there, he gives them a rundown of George's life up to that point. So George Bailey was born in a small town in upstate New York called Bedford Falls. And as a kid, he saved his brother's life after he broke through the ice on a frozen pond. And his father owned a business called the Bailey Brothers Building and Loan. So it's this savings and loan company, and it's the only rival to the major bank in town, which is owned by this movie's archetype of Scrooge, Henry Potter, the richest man in town and the owner of the bank and the owner of most of the town's property. So once George comes of age, he wants to go on a trip to Europe, and he wants to then go off to university. He's pretty much just going to leave Bedford Falls behind. But then his father suffers a stroke, and he has to cancel his trip because the building and loan is in turmoil, and he needs to stay behind to shore up all of the business deals with the building and loan before he can go off to university. But he ends up having to stay full time and send his brother off to university instead. So he ends up having to both cancel his trip and cancel his and not actually end up attending university, because the problem that he faces is that if he leaves, Potter's going to buy out the business, and then he's basically going to extort the entire town. So what this business does is it gives affordable loans to people in the town so that they can buy houses, because Potter basically charges exuberant rates, and he also rents out very low quality. He rents out very low quality housing. So throughout the movie, over the course of the years, George Bailey is able to lead these development projects, and then a bunch of people in the town are able to buy homes, and they're able to build wealth and basically build lives for themselves because of the work that George Bailey has done with the building and loans. So then it goes forward to Christmas Eve. This is where the climax of the film takes place. So George's uncle, who's working with him at the building and loans, he visits the bank. He's going to make a deposit of $8,000, but then he accidentally misplaces the $8,000 at the bank, and he loses it. So he doesn't know where the money is, and then the building and loan is going to go bankrupt without that money. So George then he looks around town for the money. They can't find it, and people are now accusing him of having stolen that money. So the money which people in town had invested in the building and loan had given to him out of trust, they now think that he stole that money. So he's now under investigation from federal agents, and he's thinking about jumping off a bridge and committing suicide. So what the angel does, he comes down and then he prevents George from actually going through with it. And then he shows him what the world would be like without him. What would the world be like if he never existed? Because he says at one point, I wish I had never been born, or something like that. So what he does, he takes him around town and shows him what the town would be like if he had never been born. So the town has been renamed Pottersville because Henry Potter named the town after himself. The building alone was shut down years earlier. Everyone's living in these old rundown houses, paying exuberant rates for them. His wife is an old maid. The kids who they had were never born. His brother died, and they have this thing in the movie where his brother was a war hero. He had shot down some Japanese fighter jets, which were going to blow up a cruiser, and he saved the cruiser. But then what happens in the movie is, because his brother died as a kid, because he wasn't there to save them, all the men on that cruiser died as well. And basically, George realizes how wonderful his life really was, and he just begs to have it back. And once the angel actually sends him back to reality, he then races home just full of joy and meets his family and they have their Christmas party. And since everyone in town, all the people who George Bailey had helped throughout his life, since they all hear that he's in trouble, all of them bring cash, and they all put money towards paying off the loss which was caused by losing this $8,000, and they basically settle his problems for him. And he then realizes just how wonderful his life is. So it's a pretty iconic story. It's something which we always see on TV every year in Canada. I mean, I don't have cable TV anymore, but I remember back when I did, CBC would always show it every year on New Year's Eve. So it's quite iconic in Canada as well. And I guess the overarching theme, other than the supernatural one and the Christmas theme, which we'll get into a bit later, but it has the same kind of struggle between the aristocrat and the oligarch that we see in A Christmas Carol. I don't need to go into this too much because I already covered this with Scrooge, but what you see is George Bailey's playing the role of the aristocrat, while Henry Potter's playing the role of the oligarch. So Potter's the richest man in town, but again, he doesn't have a family. He's just this old grouch. He can't even walk. He's in a wheelchair now, and he, even though it doesn't actually make him any better off, he's absolutely ruthless, and anything that gets in his way of increasing his wealth, he's perfectly fine with just crushing people for that. George Bailey might not be as rich as Mr. Potter, but he actually has a heart, so he actually has empathy for his fellow townspeople, and he doesn't become a wealthy man, but he becomes kind of this aristocratic figure in that he's the de facto leader of the town. He's the one that everyone goes to, and he's the one that actually brings about human flourishing for the people who see him as something of a figure of influence. So he kind of becomes that aristocrat in opposition to Potter's oligarch.
He is, but I think in a way he's kind of the anti-scrooge. So in George, because in both with Christmas Carol and It's a Wonderful Life, both men are made to look back on their lives and the decisions that they've made, which has got them where they are. Now, as we discussed, Scrooge always made morally dubious or incorrect decisions. He always put himself first, and that reached, the conclusion, the climax of where you have to have a supernatural intervention to hold up a mirror to him and say, this is what's happening. This is why it's happened. This is what's happening now, and it's going to get worse in the future for you. You're going to be damned, like Bob, like Marley, and in It's a Wonderful Life, in George Bailey he's done what he has deemed correct. So his life has been formed by reacting to situations going on around him, taking over from his dad. His brother goes off and becomes successful. And the house that he gets is drafty, and one of his children is sickly. And it's as if he's done all of the right things in life, but he hasn't been rewarded. In fact, materially, he's destroyed. And that's the way. That brings him to the brink where he's going to kill himself. And that's when the supernatural intervention comes. So unlike Scrooge, in a way, he's done everything right, but it didn't turn out. Materially, he didn't get anything from it. And so what they're saying is like, well, yeah, that may well have been the case, but let's take a step back. And again, like Scrooge, let's have a look at your life. And what would it be like if you didn't exist? So if they played that, where they did that with Scrooge, I think it's fair to say that the world would probably be better off without them. It would be people would be happier, people would have more money, and all of this kind of thing. Whereas in this, there's no doubt about it that the world would be far, far worse off if he did not exist. But he didn't realize that, and that was the lesson that he had to learn, was that actually your life is wonderful, you're a good man, and you need to appreciate it. And the $8,000 or whatever it was, that's not a big deal. The money is not important. There are things in life that are more important than money. And so you come to a very similar conclusion, even though the main narratives are almost like an inversion of each other.
And what I find interesting is there's the other theme in the movie that George Bailey never leaves Bedford Falls. So throughout the story, he basically spends his entire life in this one small town. And as a young man, even as a kid, he's dreaming of traveling. He's dreaming of being this explorer. So, even the scene when he's a kid in the parlor, and he's serving ice cream to Mary, who's going to be his wife later on. He says that, these coconuts are from Tahiti. It's all the way on the other side of the world. Look at the Pacific Ocean. Yeah, well, we talked a bit about Tahiti during the mutiny on the Bounty stream, but that's neither here nor there. And then as a young man, he's talking about how he wants to travel the world. So he's saying about how he wants this giant suitcase where he can put all of his stamps. He's planning to visit Rome and Greece and the Colosseum and the Parthenon, and then he's going to go off and be successful he's going to go to university, then be successful in the big city. So he's a big dreamer. He has these dreams of the world outside of what he describes as this boring, lousy, rundown old town. But the way that his life plays out, and really based on the decisions that he makes, so in the decisions that he feels are morally correct, he never actually ends up leaving. He never ends up leaving Bedford Falls. And what the story shows is that despite that, he actually has everything he needs to have a wonderful life there within that small little town. Now, it's very rare that you'll see Hollywood, even back then, venerate the rural over the urban. So most Hollywood movies take place in a big city, but it's very rare for them to actually romanticize the small town, be it the USA or otherwise, over the big city. Now, we don't need to get into to why that is, but what you get the sense in A Wonderful Life is that George is rooted, that there actually is a sense of rootedness, and this is part of what actually makes his life so good, that he actually knows the people of the town. So The guy who has that house down there, well, George Bailey helped him get the house. Mary, the woman he marries, well, he knew her since he was a kid, and he walks down the street. He knows the people on the street. He knows the taxi driver. He knows the cop. One thing that's kind of funny is, I don't know whether this was where Sesame Street got the name, but the cop's name is Bert, and the taxi driver's name is Ernie. So it's Ernie and Bert, and the two of them are kind of like two buddies. I don't know whether that's where that name came, where the names Ernie and Bert came from, but it's kind of interesting. And he realizes, like, in the scene when he's running home in his sweater at the end after he's been sent back to reality, he's running through the snowstorm. Great scene, and he's saying "Merry Christmas" to everyone on the street, and he's saying "Merry Christmas movie hall," "Merry Christmas buildings and loans," even saying "Merry Christmas" to the inanimate objects in the town. That's how much he feels connected to it. You get the sense that the joy really comes from that sense of rootedness. And I'm not one to really make any claims for myself. I mean, I'm from a big city, and I've traveled abroad and lived abroad and traveled the world and stuff, and I've never actually had small town life. But it's something which I do I really see the appeal there, and you kind of see that in It's a Wonderful Life, and that's something you don't really get very much from Hollywood movies.
Yeah, I mean, just as kind of a more lighthearted thing, I did note that in the scenes where he was a child, they had like what seemed to be a black slave working in the kitchen called Mammy, something like that. I know they were liberated at this point, but it was just this kind of you know when the left sort of talk about the kind of the ingrained racism and all of this. It's hard to, she had like this really heavy accent as well. She was like, "Oh, well, I do know to say." And then I think it was his brother or something kind of chased her into the kitchen and smacked her backside or something like that. And the whole family's treating her just as if she's like a child. And I just thought, yeah, like this is like one of the most, I mean, talk about classic movies. This is one of the most iconic classic movies of all time, and they have like a black woman who's like got the mentality of a 9-year-old child, like cooking the dinners, and they humor her as if like she's kind of like not all there and all of that kind of thing. And that jumped out at me as well, because when they made this film, that was just seen as being completely normal, and you realize, yeah, it really is like this is a long old thing in America. And I mean, I don't want to dwell on that too long. I just thought it's an interesting little side note there. But
what's interesting is that they actually find her endearing, whereas today they tell us that they would like want to hang her or something like that.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, that's true. But yeah, I mean, she doesn't have a quality though, does she? Like, it raises uncomfortable questions about like where we are now and where we were in the past, and the American story in that regard. She's whatever. I'm not going to worry about it too much though. Do you know what I mean? But it is in there. I mean, I didn't get, like, I was kind of confused at what his economic model was here, because the message gets back to Potter that he is building houses for what seems to be like Italian immigrants or something. And like that's sort of mentioned as an aside. And there's these new build housing complexes, and it's pointed out to Potter that he barely didn't make any money off them whatsoever. And it was as if he'd gone into banking out of the goodness of his heart, to kind of, like, he didn't seem to care about making any money off it. I just thought that was strange. Like, how was that sustainable?
Well, I mean, I'm not a finance guy, but as I understand, basically his business model was offering loans at more reasonable rates, so that they're able to build the houses but not pay a huge amount of interest off of them.
Right. So it was anti-usury.
Yeah, pretty much.
Unlike Potter, who was what he was a wasp, but kind of coded in a different way.
Yeah.
When they actually,
And also he doesn't celebrate Christmas either, so he's not at the Christmas celebration. So
yeah, well,
take from that what you will.
Yeah, well, he was Scrooge. He's basically Scrooge in this movie, I think. And just because I'm not an economics bro either, but I was actually quite I watched it late last night, and I was thinking when the kind of the banking side of it comes in, I was thinking like they really expect you like not to be stupid. Like they really expect you to have a good understanding of how banking and interest and loans work. And all of a sudden, I found that I had to actually kind of sit up and take notice. And that's because like how old this is, like nearly 80 years old. It was 1946. We're heading, so it's like 77, 78 years old. And they just assumed that the audience at the time would have a certain degree of intelligence, that in a family-friendly film like this, they can just sort of lay in all this kind of banking jargon on you and expect you, how like all of the people are running around and you get these, you just expected to know about bank runs and all of this kind of thing and how you can get around bank runs. And I thought, like, if this was made now, they would have to dumb all of that like way down. They'd have to have them like working in a Burger King or a McDonald's, and they'd have to like have a in our like idiocracy, they'd have to have like sort of charts on the wall like with burgers and then how much it costs to do a burger. So it's just to dumb it down for everybody in the audience. Whereas here, though, like it's just expected that you have a certain degree of intelligence, which I think is also just on the story itself. I think the moral questions it raises are quite complex and quite advanced. The point that I'm making is that in the kind of the 77 years since this came out, this isn't even to mention Charles Dickens Scrooge, the decline in like media is really depressing, really depressing. Just look at the heart that these things have, and then look at the way that they're addressing you like you're an intelligent adult who would even understand the morality here, the moral lessons which are being told everybody. And today, I just think I know it's Christmas. I know it's Christmas, and I'm not going to go on like a doom-laden sort of rant. But yeah, it is the case, isn't it? That today's audience of kind of like pigs just slopping up all the awful. They wouldn't even understand. Never mind the banking jargon. They wouldn't even understand the moral lessons.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's why they have to dumb down. That's why all the propaganda today has to just be so on the nose. But anyway, not to get too bogged down into that. One thing I find interesting about both A Christmas Carol and It's a Wonderful Life is the time periods which they were created in. So, like I mentioned, with A Christmas Carol, it was written during the Industrial Revolution. So, It's a Wonderful Life was released in 1946. So. And it takes place over the first half of the 20th century. So, yeah, one thing I find interesting is that they also it is also very rooted in the time period which it was created. So this is when the American dream was becoming a thing. So the prospect of owning your own home and being able to enjoy all the pleasantries of modern life, that was part of what was known as the American dream. So before the Industrial Revolution as well, the United States, it was a more rural society, just like everywhere in Europe was. And then once industrialism took hold, well, then people began to leave the old farmsteads and move into the cities, just like we mentioned earlier with the section on the Christmas Carol. Then the United States also experienced a lot of the same kind of squalor that is present in places like England during the early Industrial Revolution. But then I guess it would be hard to nail down where you'd say the American dream, or at least that kind of concept, began. I know that the phrase was coined in the 1930s, But I'd say that a lot of it would be when things like the suburbs became a thing in cities. So you could live near a city, you could have a modern job, you didn't have to live out on a farmstead, but you could have a house of your own, you can have all the modern amenities, and you can actually have that nuclear family and the golden retriever and the white picket fence, as the stereotype goes. Of course, that's unfortunately unattainable for most people these days, but nonetheless, you see that in this movie as well. So whereas in A Christmas Carol, Scrooge is helping his moral mission at the end of the movie. His new mission is to better the lives of the industrial working class in England, London, England, at the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Whereas George Bailey, it seems like his moral task is to kind of bring about what's known as the American dream, or what later would become known as the American dream for the people of Bedford Falls, and that they don't need to live in these rundown slums anymore, which they don't even own, which they're paying exuberant high prices to Potter. It's owning a house, and that's something which I always thought of Canada as this country of like homeowners, and of course that's quickly becoming a thing of the past, which is another thing which dates the movie. They show the house in the movie as this rundown, drafty place where they have to buy it and they have to renovate it themselves, and it's not much, but it's enough for them. But the thing is that the reality is that house would cost millions of dollars today, which is depressing. But nonetheless, it is interesting how It's a Wonderful Life is also set very much a thing of its time, and that you see that kind of a theme about owning a house. That's the way that you make it in the world. That's how you're going to actually build something of a life for yourself. And it's cool that they actually have that theme in there too.
I mean, there is a kind of right-wing critique of this, of specifically the American dream, which is something separate. There isn't for Scrooge, but there is where it's like we're all going to have material comfort, and we're all going to have these houses. We're all going to live on these sprawling estates, or what, like in suburbia, and live these kind of cookie cutter lives. And according to this top down, because the American dream, I think that was a sales pitch. I think that was like a PR thing, where you could get women to buy more refrigerators and you could sell them cars. And at the heart of it, like this is a sort of, it's. I don't think it's. Well, I mean, okay, it's got God and it's got angels in it, and they make jokes and everything, which is already. I think that's already a little bit kind of weird, to be honest. But like you want them. There's no real sense of the supernatural when it's this kind of like with the angel. But I don't want to be too negative about that. But it is the case where when that meme that went around, that wife jack, and everybody was fighting over it, and what they were saying on the other side of that was that it's this kind of what do they call it? They call it the longhouse sort of man who he exists to be a wage slave without any kind of higher ideals or dreams than having like the next sort of Ford. The new model of Ford car, or the new lawnmower, or all of these things. Like, and I do think there's something to that. And it seems terrible to say because we look back at this, it's kind of like this is something that people really sort of argue about, because there's one side of this, and it's both on the online right, where there's people want to look back at this and they'll say, yeah, it was so much better. It was a healthier time. It was wholesome. But then there'll be other more kind of the Nietzschean bro types, the Bronze Age mindset types, which are like, no, this was all just slavery and drudgery, and it's led us to now being nothing more than this kind of cattle, where we were kind of brought onto the pens, and these are our fields and we are cattle, and we serve our masters like slaves, and they've supplied our dreams. The Edward Bernays and these kinds of people have supplied the PR marketing and tricked us into wanting all of this stuff. And we see this as kind of like the end goal of spiritual fulfillment. And it's actually utterly void of any meaning. Like, I do have a little bit of sympathy for that. But at the same time, I just think, what is it that they expect people to do? Like, there's not really, like, we're not going off and sailing across the oceans anymore. And if to switch back to, say, Christmas Carol, like, is Bob Cratchit more noble because he lives a harder life than than what would become the American dream? Where he has like a little turkey and his son is dying of consumption or whatever it is, and they're weak and feeble and undernourished. Is that more noble then? I mean, you could say the as a population they were more. You had more dynamism, more vitality. I'm not even sure about that because the Americans were certainly not shy about waging wars in this area. The masculinity was as present, I think, in 1950 America and what it was in 1840s Victorian England, I think. But I do kind of look at this askant and think, I do, I get it. I do get it still. Like, is this your dreams came out of Edward Bernays' advertisement agency and they've all been supplied to you to keep you working and consuming forever? That's not the message of It's a Wonderful Life, though. To be fair, like, to walk that back a little bit, I don't think that is the message of A Wonderful Life. It's a Wonderful Life is saying you have to treasure the effect that you have on other people and being a good person over all of that material stuff. Like, that is the core of the message. But it is there a little bit, if you want to look at it in terms of the banking and businesses and getting new build houses up and all the rest of it.
I mean, I can see that, but I also think that it has to just be in the time period in which it's set. Just like today, I mean, people who like Bronze Age pervert, not that I want to derail the stream or anything like that. What do they expect us to do? I mean, he's not living like, this guy's not out there living like a Spartan or something like that. So, I mean, how exactly are you supposed to live this out? I mean, it seems like it's just a critique, but no actual livable way of actually living out whatever ideals which they claim to be championing. So, I think, though, it's not entirely just about like the owning a house. Now, of course, that's an important thing for people materially, but it's beyond that, though, because it actually roots you into in an area. So one of the problems that someone like me has today, and that's pretty much true for almost everyone, is that we don't own property, and that you're kind of rootless because you're just kind of moving around. If you're just a renter all your life, well, you never really are. You're never really rooted in one area. And the setting of Bedford Falls, so this is a place where now everyone in the town, they're rooted there. And for George Bailey, it's not the fact that he has a house and that he has a kitchen and a refrigerator. That's not really where his fulfillment comes from. I mean, his house was not even one of the houses that they built. It's also important to note, you mentioned earlier, like for Italian immigrants, I think there was only one Italian guy in the entire town. So it's not like, it's not like he's bringing a bunch of outsiders into the town.
Just a note on the point as well. It's almost as if they've headed off that criticism because one of the themes is that his house is drafty and it's too big, and they bought it more of a kind of romantic ideal than it climbing the property ladder, and they just wanted a big family home. And there's a little kind of in joke where every time he walks up the stairs, the banister, the thing of the banister at the bottom comes off in his hand, and it frustrates him, and he gets frustrated and he starts to point out, like, why are we living in this stupid half-rotten moldy house anyway? But then, of course, when he's had his redemption and when he sort of reaffirms his love of his family and his community and everything, he's fine with it. He points it out that he's so happy to see this drafty old house once again. So in George's case, it isn't about this kind of crawling into the Bugman longhouse sort of materialistic slave class. But you imagine like the new houses that are popping up, and it's as if it's the suburbia, just the first seeds of suburbia, which will eventually just like sprawl for miles and miles and miles and miles in all directions, and until you actually do get there.
But I think though what really makes George feel fulfilled at the end of the film is that the entire town comes together for him, so he can walk down the street and everyone knows him. Everyone says hi to him. Everyone has pleasant feelings about George Bailey, and that when he's in need, they're all going to come to his aid, and they're all going to come together and celebrate Christmas. It's not really about the material. Now, I know that it takes place at this time period, and well, I think that was just kind of the time period that was what was going on in America at the time. These suburban development projects, and well, I mean, that's just the setting of the story, but it really is more about the community, though. It's the fact that he can have an entire town full of people come together and come to his aid when he needs them, and to celebrate Christmas together. So I don't think that it's necessarily selling this kind of plastic cookie cutter American dream kind of Edward Bernays like con. I think it's more just about community, which is something you could apply to even something like a Christmas Carol, like with Ebenezer Scrooge, when he actually goes to his nephew's Christmas party towards the at the end of the movie, decides to actually show up on Christmas Day. Well, it's the feeling of togetherness. That's really where the fulfillment comes from. It's not really materialistic. So I did get the reading from the film that I don't feel like I've been subverted by finding some inspiration from someone like George Bailey, because I don't think it is a materialistic message.
We're going to go on the "It's a Wonderful Life" as subversive trash.
Yeah, we're not doing that. We're not doing that.
Purity spiral.
Yeah.
I mean, what I mentioned earlier, though, just to get back to the film itself, I mentioned earlier that it takes a long time to set itself up. And I just thought that was strange. It's 2 hours and 10 minutes long, and there's a good hour of George's life. And I hadn't seen this film forever. And so I wasn't really familiar with what was going. And there was all of the stuff about the high school prom, and it introduced so many characters. And I was thinking, this is weird, because I thought this was just like a guy having a crisis at Christmas, and an angel comes to help him. And there was like at least an hour of his life story.
Oh, it's more than an hour. I think it's most of the film.
Yeah, it's most of the film, and all of his little struggles and everything, which have got nothing to do with Christmas. But then what I realized is that when he is made a non-person, so he gets to look at the town as if he never existed, and it begins when it begins with the tree, where he goes for his car because he crashed it into a tree, and the tree's been there forever, but the car's not there. But when it really hit home for me was that they go into the pub. The pub is different because he wasn't there to give the finance to martinis. And then there's the old man from the very beginning of the film comes in, and he's a complete wreck. He just looks a complete state. And then it's pointed out that, well, he did 20 years in jail for poisoning some boy with a pill. And you go all the way back to when George is a boy, and what you see is that the shopkeeper, I think he's a chemist or something, and he has some bad news that his son would have died. Would that have been in World War I or something?
It would have been just after, but yeah. And
his son has died, and he's in a state, he can't focus properly, and he almost, well, he does. He mixes up poison for medicinal tablets, and it's George that says, "Hang on a minute." And then he actually gets clattered around a little bit by the shopkeeper. But then he makes him see, like, look what you're about to do. So obviously, if George didn't exist, then he wouldn't have been there to stop that from happening, and it would have had the repercussions that somebody down the line would have died of poisoning purely by accident, because the shopkeeper wasn't thinking straight. But he still goes to jail for like 10 or 20 years or whatever it was. And so when that happened, I thought, aha, Now I understand, because now now that we're off and he's like, we're in this mode where he doesn't exist, it's like now we can go back over all of those little plot lines and all of those little narrative threads, and we can reevaluate them and say, okay, so what happens if he wasn't there? And so another one was where his sweetheart, who he ends up marrying, she's like this lonely, miserable old spinster because she never settled down. George wasn't there to marry, so she just didn't get married. There's the other one that he's had a little bit of flirts with, and she's just turned into this kind of trollop. She's off the rails. And it's brilliantly done, that just in terms of forming a narrative and creating a storyline. That's a huge payoff, because you're expected to sit through all of that, kind of thinking, okay, well, this is. But what that does do is you're rewarded for repeat viewings, which I think is why people have watched this movie like hundreds of times, because you can go back over and that first hour will be this thing that you study the most, because you want to catch all of the little things that are in there, which you're going to get payoff for later. So just in terms of like forming a main narrative is excellently done.
Oh yeah, I mean, they even have that in the very first minutes of the movie. So I might have mentioned this earlier, but the very first scene of the movie, well, other than the introductory scene of God talking to the angels, the very first thing they show in George Bailey's life is that his brother is riding a sled in the winter, and then the sled cracks through the ice on a frozen pond, and George Bailey has to jump in and save his brother's life. And it even says that he gets an ear infection, and then he's not able to hear through one of his ears for the rest of his life after that, because the cold water infected his ear, and then he lost hearing in one of his ears. And then it says later towards the end of the movie, so just before we get to Christmas Eve, or actually just as we're at Christmas Eve, the brother's coming back from World War II. So, and it mentions that he basically saved his entire cruiser. So a Japanese kamikaze pilot, I think it was gonna crash into an American ship, and he shot down the plane and saved the ship. And well, what the spirit does, what the angel does, is he shows him his brother's grave, and it shows that his brother died when he was like a little kid, because George Bailey wasn't there to save him. And then Bailey says, well, he didn't die. He saved all those men during the war. And then the spirit just says, no, they died because you weren't there to save him. He wasn't there to save them. It's really great how they set that up, because it even works very well as a psychological kind of a film noir. I wouldn't really call it a psychological thriller, but film noir was big in this era, and it really kind of, at least that segment of the movie, that kind of third act before the big payoff at the end, it really does fit in with that genre, and it's something that they do very well. I mean, I got to say, James Stewart's performance is just absolutely incredible. Like, you really do get the sense that he's just having this mental breakdown. So when he sees Mary, who never met him because he never existed in this vision, he's screaming like, Mary, Mary, please. And then she screams as he goes up to try to embrace her. And, you just have to like the mental thought of the woman that you in reality married, the woman that you loved, that you fell in love with, that you married and had kids with, that you would go up to her and then she would just scream as if it were some random stranger going up and grabbing her. That's a pretty heavy image that's a pretty heavy thing to try to imagine. And the movie does it really well. So you really do get this feeling of dread that George Bailey, not only did all these things not happen because he wasn't alive, you really just get the sense that he's going mad and that he just desperately wants to escape. And he gets to the point where he's just begging to go back to reality, to just go back to his life when he actually existed. Funny thing is that earlier someone had actually punched him in the face because when he was angry after losing the money, he had badmouthed some man's wife on the phone, the teacher of the school. And then that man saw Bailey in the bar and he punched him in the face. But then the scene where he finally is returned to the real world, he realizes that his mouth is bleeding. And then he just says, my mouth's bleeding, Bert, my mouth is bleeding, to the cop, who now recognizes him, during the vision, the cop doesn't recognize him, and he's pursuing him around town because he thinks he's just this madman on the loose. But then when he's returned to reality, the cop says, "George, are you all right? I heard that you had some trouble." And that's kind of like the scene where he really snaps back. Really well done. I mean, in terms of being just like a psychological, and so in terms of just a psychological kind of film noir, it's also a really good movie in that regard.
Yeah. I mean, somebody in the chat said, like, in this era, they would have been worried about, like, they were trying to sort of get themselves secure in positions because they were still scared of the Great Depression, which is not that far away. And that's fair enough, because I think what that leans into is, you know, the generation here, World War One, when this was made, would have been 20 odd years, just only 20 odd years behind them. And then they would have had the Great Depression, and then they would have had World War II. And James Stewart was actually he was actually a fighter pilot in World War II. He had a, I mean, I've got it up here. He says Stewart was eventually assigned to the 445th Bombardment Group, flying B-24 Liberators over Europe. He became operations officer and later squadron commander. He flew 20 combat missions, which including bombing raids deep into Nazi Germany. He had distinguished flying crosses, 4 air medals, a presidential unit citation, and the French Croix de Guerre. I mean, his military record just goes on and on and on. Now, leaving aside, you know, whatever you think of the war and everything, there's no doubt about it that these people, they had hard, full lives. They'd really been through it. And, you know, to kind of go back on what I was saying a little bit earlier, yeah, it's all very well to sit around in the 90s or the 2000s. I mean, we're not even that comfortable anymore. We're heading back into hard times. But you know, it's easy to sit around today and think, oh, it was so awful that, you know, that we had all this stuff and we had to live on these, like, when like just say what 17 years before, yeah, well, the Great Depression dragged on and on. You know, just like a decade beforehand, you had like people on starvation rations, living in shacks, going off to war, and like 2 world wars in this era, and it was just hardship after hardship. And eventually they were like, yeah, we want to take it easy, we want to be comfortable, and we want to enjoy life. And that is the coding here. And I do, you know, it is kind of to get into this kind of postmodern sort of, oh, they were all just these kind of they were all just these consumer slaves. It's kind of pathetic because, yeah, but they'd also experienced things in life that we haven't, but we probably will be experiencing but when just looking at the absolute state of the world, it's probably coming back again. And you know, if there's any survivors on that, is anybody going to doubt them that they want to? I mean, to be fair, it all went to hell with the boomers, but it does. You do have to give them that they had been through hell.
And, you know, I mean, one thing for me that about this movie is the fact that they're celebrating Christmas in a house. So I grew up in a house in the suburbs. We had our families over. We'd have friends over on Christmas Eve and to celebrate. And then we'd go meet our extended families and have a roast together on Christmas Day. And well, I'm not to say woe is me or anything like that, but the idea of owning your own house and having that house to celebrate Christmas, and well, that's not something that's readily available to me today, and that's pretty much the case for a lot of young people. So I'm not going to lampoon this idea that, you know, there are all these consumers. I think that, you know, let's just enjoy it for the whimsy that the film really has. And I guess to close out the stream, I think we should just talk about why these two movies, or in the case of A Christmas Carol, the novella dating back to the 19th century, why they really are these timeless Christmas classics, which we hear about every year. You see various adaptations of A Christmas Carol as a kid. You probably watch It's a Wonderful Life at least once in your life, or you might even watch it every year. I know that it was a yearly tradition for many people. And there's also movies like Home Alone, which also tend to fall into that category as well. Well, I guess what I would say about that is that our culture is something which is increasingly materialistic and nihilistic, and that the things which actually provide us with meaning are really dwindling. The Christmas holiday seasons, though, it is one of those, though it's something which is grossly commercialized. Corporations try to take advantage of it and squeeze every dollar they can out of you possible. And the religious aspect of Christmas, that's more or less a thing of the past. It's still a thing for some people, but it's becoming less and less emphasized over the decades. But despite all that, the Christmas season is something which really does evoke a feeling of warmth and togetherness in modern people. To this day, it's still part of our culture, and it's something which is extremely meaningful to most people. And I think what's special about Christmas is the immaterial. I know that this is kind of just a cliche to say, but it's not the consumer junk that you buy. It's that feeling of togetherness you have with your family and friends. And I think what really hits home with both A Christmas Carol and A Wonderful Life is that that's the theme of the movie. It's the theme. It's that immaterial. It's that feeling of togetherness, that festive feeling you get around the holiday season. And both men in the story, they both discover the value, both Ebenezer Scrooge in A Christmas Carol and George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life. They discover the true value of family, community, and culture, and that Christmas is just a huge part of that. So for me, at least, that's why these are really two timeless Christmas classics.
Yeah, I love the bit when Ebenezer Scrooge, he's been reborn as a good man, and then all of that is just so magnificent. From he throws open his window and he orders the biggest goose that's on the market to be sent straight to the Cratchits, and then there's a long scene where he walks through the streets and he's just so happy and he's just wishing everybody a Merry Christmas. Absolutely wonderful. And the reason why these movies endure, these stories endure, is because it's a perennial positive, optimistic expression of the human spirit. That's what Christmas is about. It's a time to step over the snark and the know-it-all and all of the kind of cynicism and nihilism of the current age, which kind of crept in a little bit with my takes on they're living out the Edward Bernays stream. It's hard to step over the coding of all of that. I watched the Bill Murray thing, Scrooged, last week. And so this was like 1988 or 89 or something. And you can tell that it's a much more cynical age. But it is just a Scrooge story over again, except he's like a corporate media mogul. Maybe we could do that next year. And at the end of it anyway, he gives this long monologue to the camera. And it's kind of strange because it's his redemption arc and it's his, he's been born again, which they have to do. But unlike the two films that we've been talking about today, he has to sort of shake the audience out of their sort of stupor and tell them, get away from your television sets. It's called crap. Go out there and meet real people. Go out there and form, because this was peak TV era before the internet. And it's almost as if he's trying to say, you're losing connection with the real world. You have to go out there, not only, and so that there's what I mean is there's beyond just the straightforward moral quandaries which are raised in the two films we've discussed here. There's a kind of added layer of disconnect and a buffering between sort of being fully human. And I've been thinking of the Ebenezer Scrooge thing, that what I'm going to do? I am going to pledge that in the coming days, I'm going to wish 10 strangers who I've never seen before passing on the street Merry Christmas. And I'm going to, because nobody does that anymore. When I was a small boy, it happened a little bit, but I think it was kind of disappearing. And everybody kind of just walks along with their head looking at the pavement, minding their own business. What would it be like in this day and age if you saw a complete stranger and you just said Merry Christmas. Like, wow.
You know, you want to know something funny? That actually happened to me. So after spending years away from Canada mostly due to COVID, I wasn't even able to travel there for a long time. When I finally got back to, and funny thing is, I actually I got stranded in London for a day, mostly due to the COVID stuff, by the way. And while I was stuck in London for an unplanned day, I actually listened to A Christmas Carol, the full novella, over the during the day that I was waiting for my flight that I could finally get to Canada. And I finally got the chance to celebrate Christmas with family members who I hadn't seen for several years. And I went for a walk that afternoon. So after you do you open your presents, you feel excited, you have some breakfast, you have some tea or whatever it is. Kind of that malaise when you just start to say, okay, like the presents, the kind of morning, the Christmas morning's over. Now we're just kind of going to relax for the day. I went for a walk around the neighborhood, and the neighborhood I had grown up in, and a guy walked past me, and he said something. I couldn't really hear what he said, but he said Merry Christmas, and then I kind of for a second kind of paused, and I was like, but then I just realized I said Merry Christmas. And I said, yeah, Merry Christmas. And I felt good about that. It took me a second, but then I felt good about it. And it was just some guy. I never met him before, but we were just both out for a walk in the neighborhood on Christmas Day. And he wished me a Merry Christmas. And I thought, why don't people do that anymore? And that felt really good.
I would have said, you what, mate? You what? You know,
I did. I actually said, I actually kind of looked at him like, what? And he's like, Merry Christmas. I'm like, oh, Merry Christmas.
Are you bent? What do you want? Are you, you know what I mean? Yeah, it's why don't people wish each other Merry Christmas on the streets anymore? I'm going to do that this year. That's my pledge. And you can ask me about it on maybe next Christmas. Because, you know, it's got that weird thing where after Christmas, you tend not to get into this kind of thing anymore because the glow is gone. But yeah, I want to have an enchanting Christmas. That's what it's all about. And that's what these movies do. You put aside the cynicism, put aside the snark and the postmodern know-it-all bullshit and just go with the flow and you'll not regret it. So, yeah, I'll Merry Christmas to classic movie fans.
Yep, Merry Christmas to you all. So, do you know what we're going to be doing for the first stream of next year?
No, I haven't a clue.
All right, well, it's not the time to think about that because we're all going to enjoy our holidays over the coming couple of weeks.
I mean, I'm certainly going to be lounging around watching plenty of old movies for the next week or so. So that should be easy enough. I'll see.
Okay, that sounds good.
All right. Thanks for all the likes and reading me stuff this year, everybody. And Merry Christmas, and I'll see you later.
So, just before I sign off, I just wanted to say that I know it's been a while since you've seen content from me, but that's because I'm working on a big project right now. Hopefully, I'll have that out in the coming weeks. So that should be out on YouTube, I'd say early January at some point. But that's kind of political stuff, and Christmas isn't about that. So I want to wish you all a Merry Christmas, and as Tiny Tim said, God bless us, everyone.